We talk a lot about North Korea, right? Their military, their secrecy. But there's another story, a crisis, actually. What if I told you they might be facing population collapse, like by 2034?
hmm
Crazy, right?
Yeah, it's not something you hear every day, but it's a real concern. See, their fertility rate, the number of births per woman, it's way too low, only about 1.79. To keep a population stable, you need at least 2.1. That's called the replacement level fertility rate, and they're falling way short.
So it's more than just fewer babies, then. What does this mean long term for North Korea?
Well, think of it like this. Fewer people means fewer workers. And in a country like North Korea, where so much depends on manual labor, that can cripple industries, agriculture, the whole system.
So their foundation is literally shrinking, makes this whole deep dive even more interesting and kind of scary. How do we even start to unpack this?
Well, to understand where they are now, we got to look back. North Korea's demographics. It's been a wild ride, shaped by huge events like the Korean War, the division of the peninsula.
Yeah, the Korean War. Millions dead, people displaced. Obviously, that's going to mess with population stuff, but how?
Initial impact, total devastation, of course. But then rebuilding, Soviet influence. There was this surge in births. The 1970s, they were close to 4 births per woman. Imagine that.
A post-war baby boom. Makes sense, right? Hope, rebuilding.
Yeah.
But things went south later on, didn't they?
Exactly. Didn't last. Debt crisis in the 70s, and the Soviet Union collapses in the 90s. That's support. Gone.
Yeah.
Overnight. Severe food shortages.
That roller coaster took a nosedive. Hard to imagine starting a family when everyone's just struggling to survive.
It was brutal. Fertility rates just plummeted. And to really get how bad it got, we got to look at where they are economically, even today.
Okay, numbers time. What's the economic situation in North Korea like right now?
Their gross national income per person, it's incredibly low. Only $1,217, one of the lowest in the entire world.
Wow, that's hard to even grasp. What does that mean for daily life? Are we talking like constant hunger, limited health care?
It's all of that. Struggling for basic needs. Put yourself in their shoes for a second. Scarcity everywhere. How do you even think about bringing a child into that? It's heartbreaking, the choices these families face.
It's not just basic costs either. We saw that their maternity benefits are so meager you can't even buy 2 pounds of rice. That's a powerful image.
It is. And it's forcing a cultural shift. See, North Korean women were traditionally in the home, right? Now, they're the breadwinners, more and more.
So they're choosing work over family. That's a huge change in a society that's so traditional.
A lot of them are delaying marriage, not having kids at all. They have to survive. Not a choice they make lightly.
It really shows how deep this crisis goes. So how does all this compare to North Korea's neighbors? Aren't low birth rates a problem in lots of developed countries?
True, yeah. China, Japan, even South Korea, they're all dealing with similar stuff. But there's a difference.
Okay, so what makes North Korea's situation so unique, even compared to other countries with similar trends?
Those other countries, they have things to help soften the blow. Technology, strong economies, immigration. North Korea, none of that.
So same trends, but they're way more vulnerable. And what does that mean? What are the consequences of this, not just for them, but for the whole region?
Well, for one, their workforce shrinks, right?
Yeah.
In a country dependent on manual labor, that cripples them. Industries, agriculture, everything.
And that kind of instability in a country that's already unpredictable, could that lead to, what, conflict?
That's the big worry. Geopolitical instability. It's not out of the question.
Like war with their neighbors.
It's possible. Think about it. More people fleeing North Korea. That puts huge pressure on places like South Korea and China.
Makes you think. This isn't just numbers, it's people's lives we're talking about.
Right. And it goes deeper. An aging population inside North Korea. More people needing support. That's a huge burden on their system. Could cause instability from within.
So, economic collapse, regional instability, maybe even unrest within North Korea, all because of this population crisis. But what about the leadership? Kim Jong-un, how does this affect him?
For him, this is more than an economic problem. It's a threat to his power. Demographic collapse could undermine his whole regime.
So can they turn things around? Is there anything North Korea can do, or are they headed for a collapse?
There are things they could do. Structural reforms, make life better for people, loosen up the economy a bit, invest in things like healthcare, education.
Oh my, Doug, I feel like there's got to be a but here.
What? Will they? That's the question. Right now, their focus is on the military, on control.
A catch-22. What they need to do is the opposite of what they want to do.
Yeah, it's a troubling paradox. It really begs the question then, if North Korea won't or can't change, what's the rest of the world supposed to do? Is it our problem?
That's the tough one, isn't it? Feels like we're walking a tightrope, ethically speaking.
Yeah, you've got a sovereign nation. They don't like outside interference, and their track record. They put their own agenda first, even if their people suffer.
But then there's this potential crisis unfolding, and it could affect everyone. We can't just sit back and watch, can we?
And ignoring it has its own UN risks, right? A North Korea that's falling apart, economy tanked, unrest everywhere. That's a recipe for conflict, mass migration, maybe even nuclear stuff.
Those are some scary scenarios. But going into a country with that kind of military, unpredictable leadership seems crazy risky.
It's dangerous, no doubt. Could escalate things, miscalculations. Any intervention would have to be thought out carefully, get the regional players involved, clear goals.
So what's left? Diplomacy, sanctions, aid. Is there a right answer here?
No easy ones, that's for sure. You got to be nuanced. Address the immediate suffering, but also try to nudge North Korea in a better direction, long term.
Okay, but what does that actually look like? How do we walk that tightrope?
Maybe it's a combo, right? Targeted sanctions so you're not hurting everyday people, but hitting the regime where it hurts, and diplomacy trying to build some trust, make progress bit by bit.
A carrot and stick approach. But how do we make sure those sanctions actually work? That they don't end up making things worse for the people we're trying to help?
That's the trick, yeah. Got to think carefully about how different parts of their economy would be affected. Be ready to change things up depending on how the regime reacts. It's tough.
And what about aid? We can't just ignore the suffering, right? But how do we help without propping up the regime itself?
Aid is vital, but it has to be done right. Channels that are transparent, accountable, so the regime can't exploit it.
So strategic and compassionate, this all seems so complicated. Are there any examples, like historically, that could guide us?
There are definitely situations we can learn from, other times when intervention was on the table. The hard part is applying those lessons to North Korea, because they're so unique.
Speaking of unique, we've been talking big picture, but what about the people on the ground? What does this crisis mean for everyday North Koreans? Beyond the politics, what's life actually like?
Right, got to remember the human side of this. Those statistics, the geopolitics, there are real people living through this.
So what are they facing? Besides the economic stuff, what does this crisis actually look like?
Imagine a life where just getting food, shelter, healthcare is a daily struggle. Education, limited, especially for girls. Families having to make impossible choices.
And that shift we talked about, women becoming the providers, how's that affecting families, society? Is it causing tension?
Big changes for sure. Gender roles are changing. Lots of uncertainty about the future. Young people, they're pressured to support families, but there's no opportunities. So many are putting off marriage, kids.
It's almost like two generations clashing, older folks holding on to the past, young folks dealing with a totally different reality.
Yeah, kind of. You've got the older generation with their values and expectations, and then the young facing this harsh economy, no prospects.
And this is all happening under a regime known for control, repression. How does that play into daily life for North Koreans?
It's a weird mix. On one hand, they're pushing for more babies, bigger families, but then their policies, their focus on the military, all the restrictions, it makes having kids almost impossible.
It's like they're trying to force population growth, but creating conditions that make it impossible. Doesn't seem sustainable.
It's a tough balancing act for them. They need people to keep their system going, but they also need to stay in control. It's a contradiction.
So for the average family just trying to make it, what are their options? What do they hope for?
They're stuck making tough choices. Can they afford kids when they're so little? Old beliefs are being challenged as women's roles change.
All this under a system that gives them no support, no freedom. It reminds you that demographics aren't just numbers, they're people's lives, their hopes and struggles.
Exactly. And it makes the question of what the rest of the world should do even more urgent.
So we've laid out some pretty serious challenges and the potential fallout for everyone. But what happens, NW? What are the possible paths forward for North Korea and for the rest of us trying to figure out how to respond?
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. History, economics, potential fallout. It feels like we're at a turning point. What are the possible outcomes, the scenarios we could see play out? And what can the outside world actually do about any of this?
It's messy, for sure. Lots of factors at play. But let's try to imagine some paths forward. Got to start somewhere, right? Let's say, for argument's sake, we take the optimistic view.
Okay, rose-colored glasses time. Is there any way North Korea could turn this around? Reverse the population decline, avoid the worst-case stuff we talked about?
Not impossible, but it would take a huge EE shift. Imagine a North Korea that actually focuses on its people, not just the military. Economic reforms, opening up to the world.
That's a very different North Korea than what we see in the news. What would that actually look like? What would they have to DO? They have to basically flip their whole system. Invest in their people, healthcare, education. Make it easier to do business, attract foreign investment, fix the things that are driving people away.
Right.
Basically dismantle the very things their regime is built on.
That's a huge EE ask. I mean, it's nice to think about, but realistically, with Kim Jong-un and his history, does that seem likely?
To be honest, it's a long shot. They haven't shown any interest in that kind of change. Opening up could mean losing control, and that's a risk they don't seem willing to take.
So, best case scenario, not looking too good. Let's go the other way. What's the worst that could happen if this just keeps getting worse? Give me the bleakest picture.
It could get really bad, not just for them, but for everyone. Imagine North Korea collapsing. Economy in ruins, not enough food, people desperate, their workforce shrinks, they can't even keep basic things running.
Yeah.
You're talking about a failed state, a breeding ground for instability that could spread to other countries.
That's a scary thought. A failed state in that region. And then there's their nukes on top of it all.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A desperate regime with nukes. They might use them, try to get concessions, or just lash out. The stakes are huge.
So we've got best case, unlikely, worst case, terrifying. What's the most likely thing to happen? The messy middle ground.
Sadly, it's probably a slow decline, like watching a building crumble. Population shrinking, economy stagnant, the regime gets more isolated, more paranoid, but they hold on tight to power, even as everything falls apart around them.
And the rest of the world just watches. Cleans up the mess when it finally collapses.
It's not that simple. Ignoring it doesn't make it go away. If North Korea collapses, it'll be a huge humanitarian disaster, a security vacuum that'll suck in their neighbors, the whole world, really.
So doing nothing isn't an option either. But then what do we do? How do we even approach something this complicated and dangerous? Are there any good options here?
Not easy ones, that's for sure. But we can't give up. Diplomacy's got to be part of it. Keeping lines of communication open, even if it's just a thread, might help prevent misunderstandings, create some space for working together in the future.
Talking's important, but we can't just talk. We need action, too. What does that look like?
You got it. Sanctions could work, but they got to be targeted. Hit the regime, not the people. Put pressure on them to change, but without making life harder for ordinary North Koreans.
So, like, going after luxury goods, industries that benefit the elite. But how do you actually DO that, make sure it's effective and doesn't backfire?
It's a challenge, yeah. Got to really think about the impacts, be ready to adapt on the fly, depending on how they react.
Then what about aid? People are suffering. We can't turn our backs on them, right? But how do we help without helping the regime stay in power?
Aid's absolutely necessary, but it has to be done carefully. Through channels we trust, with accountability, so the regime can't just take it for themselves. Compassion AD strategy.
Sounds like we need a multi-pronged approach. Diplomacy, smart sanctions, careful aid. But doesn't that risk making the North Koreans angry? Like we're meddling. Could it actually make things worse?
There's always that risk, yeah. They don't trust anyone, and any move we make could be seen as an attack. But doing nothing is worse. If we just sit back, millions will suffer, and the chances of a total collapse just go up.
It's like trying to defuse a bomb that's sitting in a house that's also on fire. Got to do both at the same time.
It's a long game, no doubt. Patience, strategy, and a willingness to work with a very difficult, unpredictable partner. No easy fixes. It's about minimizing the damage, managing expectations, and understanding that every move we make or don't make has consequences.
Heavy stuff. This isn't just a North Korea problem, is it? It shows how populations, economics, politics, it all ties together. A reminder that we're all connected.
Exactly. And it forces us to think about some tough ethical questions. When a country's doing terrible things to its own people, where's the line between respecting their independence and our obligation to help? Those are questions without easy answers.
Lots to think about, but that's what we're here for, right? We dug into the history, the economics, the potential consequences. Hopefully our listeners have a better grasp on this crisis now, how important it is, not just for North Korea, but for all of us. I